As we draw closer to Christmas, everyone will soon be tucked up at home, ready for some family time, cosy pyjamas, and wholesome content. So, what better way to spend that time than with another video of biker gangs brutally murdering each other? If you are an avid Mad Lad enjoyer, then I'm sure you've all seen the previous video where we covered the Great Nordic Biker War, where a bunch of Viking-themed bikers broke into military bases and blew up clubhouses and prisons with literal rocket launchers, among many other things. And despite the Nordic Biker War sounding like a greatly exaggerated episode of Sons of Anarchy, there was actually another war that somehow had even more casualties. The Quebec Biker War. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, it is in fact ya boy, super cool game. Winter is the perfect time to cozy up at home with a mobile game that you can really get stuck into. In this game, there are over 800 incredible champions ranging from lizard-like creatures to elves, orcs, dwarves and demons, each one looking exceptionally cool. A couple of champions I can recommend to you would be Tormund the Cold of the Dwarves faction for his aura skill, which increases your entire team's defense by 33%, a really good skill to keep everyone in the fight. He's also a great choice for clearing wave-based content effectively, including areas in the late game such as faction wars and Doom Tower rooms. And then there is Whirling Frost King, who not only looks really cool, he has a skill to be able to place a perfect veil or veil on an ally with the lowest HP, and he attacks all enemies with his second skill. And he also places important debuffs such as decreased crit damage and decreased accuracy. The holidays are just around the corner and Raid Shadow Legends is here with the Cursed City with 100 stages to complete, including stages where you need to take down 2 of Raid's bosses at the same time. When the weather outside is frightful, you need something delightful, right? Well, Raid Shadow Legends has you covered. They are celebrating this festive season this month with Raid's Christmas Story, a special holiday-themed event where you can follow Sir Nicholas through a festive story. It comes with mini games to solve and a chance to win both in-game and real-life prizes. So head to www.raidxmas.plarium.com and there are all sorts of themed events, tournaments, summon boosts and other surprises, with a month-long Yuletide Titan event where you can earn awesome in-game rewards. So, what are you waiting for? Go check out Raid Shadow Legends and cozy up in Teleria this holiday season. If you haven't started playing yet, then what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen to get insane bonuses available only via my link. You will get 2 epic champions with my link, not 1, but 2, all at once. The first one is Lightsworn, a very strong epic champion from the Sacred Order. His kit allows you to keep a team alive with an increased defense buff and a revive on death skill. And the second is Epic Juliana after you reach level 15, an epic champion and a boss killer from the Sacred Order. She is an attack type warrior wielding the magic affinity, thus very powerful against enemies with affinity. Once you are in and crushing your enemies, come find me under the name Count Dankula TV and join my clan, the Dank Brigade, and we will be legends together. Join my clan. Show Raid some love and click the link. Don't forget to use my Raid Shadow Legends link in the description or scan my QR code on the screen to get insane bonuses for new players with awesome champions. Canada, known for their love of hockey, maple syrup, polite manners, and of course that silly little enclave of poutine munching frogs.
The hamburger pedophile, yeah.
Jokes aside, there are more things to Canada besides these stereotypes, and outlaw bikers are one of them. But you might be thinking, but Dank, how did these lumberjacks turn into bikers? Well, let's briefly talk about the spread of motorbike gangs in Canada and the influence of the American gangs. Now, I'm not going to be outlining the entirety of biker history in North America because that would take far too long. Instead, I'll just give you a brief rundown on how these gangs spread, which is not too dissimilar to the examples that we've seen in Europe. Of course, with Canada being the northern neighbour of the country with the most well-known biker gangs, it was only a matter of time before those gangs spread into Canada. However, just like every other country with the popularisation of motorcycles and cool biker gangs being shown on TV and in the news, like most gangs that spread around the world, people just thought it looked cool and decided to copy them. Surprisingly for Canada, their homegrown bikers would have a strong grip on the nation until the 90s, before the American biker gangs did what they did in Europe and started to move in. Outlaw motorcycle gangs would start popping up in Quebec as early as the 1950s, and by 1968 there would be over 300 gangs consisting mostly of local biker groups. But it wouldn't be until the next decade that the so-called golden age of Canadian bikers would kick in. And these gangs would go from your local rough and tough gangs to some of the largest drug dealers in all of Canada. But, as we all know, before you have a golden age, you have to have a dark age. But for Quebec, this would be titled as the Grande Noirceur. I think that's how it's pronounced. Don't know, don't care to find out. But in English, it means the Great Darkness. Basically, between 1936 to 1960, Quebec was run by the ultra-conservative Catholic Union Nationale Party. But by the early 60s, they were eventually defeated by the Quebec Liberals. This would bring forward one of the most radical changes to Quebec society, and slowly the province would undergo a so-called quiet revolution. This quiet revolution would see Quebec going from one of the most conservative areas in North America to being the most liberal. This was a backlash to societal conservatism, and things ended up swinging to the opposite side as soon as the Quebec Liberal Party was in power, bringing in all of the bad things that liberalism usually causes. The 60s brought Quebec a litany of illegitimate births, extensive drug use, and of course, heightened crime, compared to other areas of Canada. The tighter the social norms were, the more that people wanted to rebel against the man. Or in this case, the frog. This is very important because these social backlashes of fatherlessness and drug use were the perfect foundations for outlaw motorcycle gangs. As you can imagine, young men within Quebec who came from a rough background and had no father could look up to and idolise the macho biker lifestyle. This is very common across the world, where you get young and naive men of poor backgrounds without a strong father figure who will then look for a strong man to look up to. But very often it's the wrong kind of strong man, which led to a lot of these young men being manipulated into crime. You've got that James Dean type look, young, badass, and of course, a rebel. This fits perfectly to counter the norm of just being a number within the conservative frog machine. This symbol of not only freedom but masculinity would contribute massively to the expansion of those 300-something biker gangs. Recruits were rife within Quebec. It got so bad that there was basically no more territory left. Every area was controlled by a biker gang, which resulted in hundreds of gangs all fighting each other over various territories for drug deals, prostitution, racketeering, you name it. Quebec would eventually be designated as the red zone in the outlaw biker sphere. It got so bad that even some hitmen wouldn't set foot there because it was too dangerous for them. So, yeah, things got pretty bad. Now, although the main focus of this video will be detailing the Quebec Biker War, just like the previous video, we have to detail previous events that led up to it. Why? Well, this wasn't the first biker war in Canada, more specifically Quebec. There was actually 2 more biker wars that happened before this. The first war, which spanned from 1974 to 1976, commonly titled as the First Montreal Biker War, was the first large-scale war between bikers that shocked the nation. This was soon followed up by the First Biker War, which happened between 1977 and 1984, which is a little confusing because technically that was the Second War. So why was the second large-scale biker war in Canada titled the First Biker War? We aren't sure, we actually couldn't figure that one out. Potentially, it was due to a lack of media coverage of the First War, so that when the Second War broke out, everyone thought it was the first one. And they all started calling it the first one, and the name just kind of stuck. So the main prelude to the Quebec Biker War, which happened in the 90s, was these two previous wars. So briefly, we'll touch on those before we move on to the main event. Which isn't to downplay these two previous wars, because by themselves they were pretty fucking serious conflicts. So let's start with the First Montreal War. Now, it's going to be a little bit annoying trying to keep track of the various biker gangs throughout all of these wars, since a lot of them chop and change. So keep in mind that some older gangs that we discuss will eventually merge or be patched over into other gangs, or they will change their name and rebrand, or they will simply just stop existing, and so on and so on. So it might be a little bit difficult to keep track of who is who. As with most wars, there were two sides. On one side was the Outlaw MC backed Satan's Choice MC and Devil's Disciples MC. And on the other side, there was the Hells Angels backed Popeyes MC along with the Dubois brothers. Just like the other wars we've covered in Europe, the biker gangs from the United States are of course involved again, but initially just on a supporting basis. So, just like the Cold War with the USSR and the USA, rather than just going in head first, these larger American gangs planned on just supporting local groups who would eventually become part of their larger network of biker gangs throughout North America. Sometimes providing weapons and funds to these groups who were not full members of the American gangs. These guys were just affiliates. And affiliate MCs usually have to prove themselves before they can become full members. But the main basis of this particular war was caused through a mixture of turf wars, drug distribution, and old rivalries. You see, the Devil's Disciples had made connections with the Outlaw MC in the United States because they could use their gang to funnel drugs into the US. The benefit of the Satan's Choice MC and Devil's Disciples is that they could produce meth and PCP quite easily because in Canada they have quite a spread out population with a lot of rural areas, meaning the production of the drugs could be done a lot more remotely and not attract any unwanted attention. So, the Devil's Disciples made the drugs, smuggled them into the US to the Outlaws, who then distributed them. Along with this, the markup for selling the drugs in the United States was much greater than it was in Canada, meaning they could make a lot more money selling it in the US instead of selling it locally. So, the Outlaws had the benefit of gaining a steady drug supply, whilst also gaining support territory up north against their rivals, the Hells Angels. But this of course caused a lot of issues with other biker gangs. Mainly with one of the largest biker gangs at the time in Canada, Popeyes MC. Popeyes had previous disputes not with Satan's Choice, but with their allies, the Devil's Disciples. And seeing them making some big moves within Quebec pissed them off, and Popeyes had considered Quebec to be their territory alone. So they saw this as the perfect opportunity to ruin the satanic meth scheme while taking the territory and drug market all for themselves. This would further escalate when other non-biker gangs would support each side, with the Dubois brothers, a gang of 9 brothers within Montreal, supporting Popeyes, and even the Irish mob known as the West End Gang backing the Devil Worshipper guys. Which is a little bit ironic. This war wouldn't last very long, however, but it still made a mark in Quebec history because quite a few people were killed. In total, there were 20 deaths, with Yves Trudeau rising to fame as the Apache or the Mad Bomber, where he had killed several of Devil's Disciples members. Only 4 members of the Popeyes MC had died during the war, with the rest of the casualties consisting of Devil's Disciples. And due to the amount of them being killed, the Devil's Disciples eventually disbanded in 1976. The war was pretty wild, and it escalated way faster than other gang wars that we've seen. Shootings were happening left, right and centre, people were being stabbed and attacked, and car bombs were being set off. It was truly quite a mad one, but this was just the beginning. Eventually, the war would die down with the disbandment of the Devil's Disciples and the arrest of the Dubois brothers. But as I said, this was just the beginning, and this conflict had set the foundations for the next war, which would kick off in 1977. You see, both sides had been severely weakened after just those few years of violence, which resulted in heavy government crackdowns, since many of them were now either dead or in prison. So, this of course was the perfect time for the Hells Angels to try and make a move on Quebec. Due to the Outlaws MC basically saying fuck you to the Hells Angels and challenging their supremacy within Canada, the Hells Angels would of course retaliate in a major way. The perfect opportunity would arise for the Outlaws MC, however, as the main club that they were supporting, the Satan's Choice MC, had some leadership issues. Their leader at the time, Bernie Gwindon, was actually sent to prison for narcotics charges, which led to the gang to fracture. So the Outlaws would end up lapping up the leftover chapters, patching them over to the Outlaws. And for those of you that didn't watch the last video, getting patched in means that you become a full member of whatever gang patched you in. But the Outlaws weren't the only ones patching over clubs, because the Hells Angels would do one further and eventually patch over the Popeyes MC gang, gaining them a very large foothold within Canada. The gangs would have small scuffles and fights in 1977, but it wouldn't be until early 1978 where the war would really kick off. Your boy Yves Apache Trudeau would escalate things after he shot and killed a member of the Outlaws MC alongside wounding another. The Outlaws, of course, didn't take this too kindly and shit hit the fan. Several assassinations would ensue and bombings were going off all over the place, soon leading to what was called the Tourbillon Massacre. In 1978, 2 Outlaw MC members followed some Hells Angels members and they shot 3 of them, with 1 being wounded. But things wouldn't go well for the Outlaws after this shooting, as more of their members would again be bombed by Yves Trudeau. I swear, Yves Trudeau could probably get his own Mad Lad video. He was absolutely mental during these wars, and he was considered the most notable assassin during these conflicts. I mean, the guy had killed a minimum of 43 people over the course of 12 years, and that's just the ones he was caught for. And the reason he earned the name the Mad Bomber was because he kept bombing everyone. He just kept blowing everybody up. Some coked up 5'6" French Canadian going around planting car bombs and shooting people. I mean, just at the end of this second conflict, which is still called the first conflict, but it wasn't, it was the second conflict, an estimated 62 to 72 people were killed, with over 100 being injured, which, compared to the first war, was a major increase in violence. Generally, this war was considered a win for the Hells Angels because they managed to not only hold their ground, but expand further into Canada, while the Outlaws still managed to keep a solid hold on Ontario. You can see that there are 2 common themes within these wars: drugs and territory. These were the 2 main things that the bikers within Canada would fight over, as the majority of their trade was in drugs. Of course, they would touch on other practices like racketeering, loan sharking, prostitution, so on and so on. So, with those explanations of the 2 previous wars, let's get into the big one. Things would calm down by 1984, and the next war wouldn't kick off until almost 10 years later. However, between the wars, there were plenty of one-offs and skirmishes here and there, because, they're still biker gangs. They hate each other, they fight. But notably, there was another massacre, but this time within the Hells Angels chapter themselves. You see, the Canadian Hells Angels were split into 2 chapters, North and South. And even though they were all Hells Angels, these 2 chapters had a pretty big rivalry with each other. One of the issues was that the northern chapter was pretty unruly, even by biker standards. They would very often act out, skim profits, not follow orders, and of course, get high on their own supply, which they were supposed to sell. They would constantly get arrested for small offences, constantly attracting the attention of the authorities, which, if you're trying to get involved in organised crime, the last thing you want to hear is that young Pierre has just been nicked for pissing in the street and got caught with a fuck ton of meth on him. That kind of draws the attention of people that you don't want looking into your business. Being a gang, you want to attract as little attention as possible from the authorities because you don't want them sniffing around your junior members because that leads them on to the more senior members, and before you know it, everyone's doing a life sentence. So these members being idiots really didn't help. And it wasn't just the Hells Angels' own members that had noticed this tomfoolery. Other gangs that they did business with, such as the West End gang that we discussed previously, and the Rizzuto crime family, who were, as you can guess, an Italian mob group based in Quebec, saw all of this as a ticking time bomb. Since if the people you worked with were drawing too much attention, it was only a matter of time before that attention was on you. So it made a lot of these people very reluctant to work with the Hells Angels. So that was a pretty major problem. These other organised crime groups wanted their business partners to get their colleagues in check, because they of course don't want to be dealing with a low-level street gang that could get them caught. So there was a secret meeting held by the South chapter, and it was deemed that the North chapter had to be liquidated. Which is pretty brutal even by Hells Angels standards. I mean, sure, it's not unheard of that they have killed their own members in the past, but a whole chapter, that's a pretty big deal. The South chapter announced that there was going to be a party, and that it was mandatory for the North members to attend. As you can imagine, when the 5 members from the North chapter arrived, they were met by 41 very unhappy bikers. Under the chapter leader's orders, the 5 men were put into the centre of the clubhouse, and they were all shot dead. Which is just pretty fucking brutal. This massacre created a strong reputation for the Hells Angels in the criminal underworld. It sent a very strong message to their enemies and a very strong message to their own members, letting them all know that they would tolerate absolutely no fuckery. But it did also cause personal issues with several of the leftover members, leading to a few of them founding a smaller gang called the Rock Machine just a year later. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why didn't the Hells Angels just wipe out this new MC? Well, the founders of the newly made Rock Machine were of Italian descent. Brothers Salvatore and Giovanni Cazzetta, who had ties with the Montreal Mafia. So, of course, not wanting to start a war with the Mafia, but also wanting to keep their current business partners, the Hells Angels just avoided challenging the new gang, as long as their mob-connected leaders were still in charge, which kind of kept the peace. But, of course, this wouldn't last very long. The Hells Angels eventually started using the tactics of creating so-called puppet clubs, where members were tempted with the chance to be a prospect, but only if they did all the dirty work. Basically, dangle the carrot in front of guys you have no intention of actually recruiting and just using them as cannon fodder, which took all of the heat away from the high-level proper members. Flash forward to the early 90s and the likelihood of a war was ramping up as the Hells Angels attempted to gain a monopoly over the drug trade at a street level. This opportunity was given to them when the leader of Rock Machine MC was arrested for importing 200 kilograms of cocaine from the US into Canada in 1994. Due to Rock Machine's connections with the Mafia, it was a perfect circle. The Mafia were well-respected businessmen that could easily import the drugs, which would then be passed on to the bikers to trade it on the streets. But now that Rock Machine's leader was behind bars, Rock Machine lost its only member that was connected enough for the other gangs to allow them to operate. Basically, if they went after them now, there would be no repercussions from the Mafia. So, with him gone, the Hells Angels saw their chance to take control of the market within Montreal. This would put many other gangs out of business. So, not to soy out, but it was literally an Avengers moment. The local drug gangs, along with Rock Machine, would form an alliance against the Hells Angels, and I shit you not, it was literally called Alliance to Fight the Angels. You can't make that shit up. It's like a comic book writer was told, hey, we need you to write a cool story about bikers fighting over the drugs trade in Canada, but please make sure you give it a gay name. So, with the creation of the Hells Angels puppet clubs, their plan was to pressure the local bars and drug dealer controlled areas into giving over their trade to them. By force, of course. But of course, after the alliance was formed, they rejected the Angels' offer, and the group of dealers, along with Rock Machine MC, launched a series of attacks against the Angels. And so began the war. The initiating attack that would kick off the war would happen in July of 1994, where 3 masked-up Rock Machine associates shot Pierre Dost, a member of a Hells Angels puppet chapter, while he was at a motorcycle shop in Montreal. The very next day, another hit was attempted against another Hells Angels member, which failed, along with another attempted attack on another Hells Angels puppet club, where 5 Rock Machine members were arrested with guns and explosives. So, in just a few short days, the violence had escalated very quickly. A few days later, the Hells Angels would eventually hold a meeting concerning the ongoing attacks, and they discussed if they should go to war or not. Although a few of them were hesitant, many of the leadership were really wanting to hit back at the alliance. So it was decided that the Hells Angels, with their leader, Maurice Boucher, would spearhead an all-out war with the alliance. Over the next year, there would be so many attacks between the two sides. It was just absolutely mental. I could sit here and do what I did in the Nordic Bikers video and list all the attacks one by one, but the problem with the Quebec Biker War is all of the attacks are kind of the exact same. Gun down in a bar, gun down on the highway, gun down in a motorcycle shop, gun down outside of their clubhouse, or a car bomb was planted outside of the clubhouse. There was an awful lot of bombings during this conflict. However, unfortunately, all of the attacks are kind of the same. They're all just carbon copies of each other. The only thing that really changes is the names. So I could sit here and list all of the attacks, but I would just be saying the same stuff over and over again. Plus, we would be here all day, and eventually that would get pretty boring. Also, the bikers were very, very fond of using dynamite that they stole from building sites and mines, because this sent out a much louder message to the rival gang. So, yeah, during this time, they were going absolutely ham with the explosives. But, funnily enough, these bikers aren't exactly well-trained sappers or had previous military training like a lot of the bikers over in Europe had. So, either during the attack itself or when making the bombs, they would very often blow themselves up. There were no limits for these bikers, and they even went as far as to murder several prison guards, so this wasn't a war limited to just the bikers. Sadly, among these attacks there was the brutal killing of 11-year-old Daniel Desrochers, or Desrockers, don't know how to pronounce it, I'm very sorry about that, in 1995. He died from shrapnel wounds from a car bomb that was placed in a drug dealer's Jeep, who was a rival of the Hells Angels. Things got so bad that the Canadian police eventually formed a specific joint unit named the Wolverine Squad to counter the bikers during the war, especially after the death of an 11-year-old boy. Another innocent caught up in the war was Michel Auger, who reported a crime that he had witnessed being committed by the Hells Angels to the police. And in September of the year 2000, he was shot 6 times in the back after refusing to keep quiet after the Hells Angels tried to intimidate him into silence. Thankfully, he survived the attack somehow, but this just goes to show the extent of the war and how many people were affected, as well as the lengths that some of these biker gangs were willing to go to. And just like what happened in Europe, public perception of biker gangs turned to absolute hatred. And it got so bad that it prompted Hells Angels and Rock Machine to just announce a ceasefire and just instantly end the war. Seriously, that's how it ended. They both just went, this is getting really bad. Will we stop? Yeah, fuck this shit, let's stop. That was it. That was the end of the war. And to commemorate the truce, the bikers all went to the most expensive strip club in Montreal together, with photographers there to document their newly made friendship. Seriously, they were all just in the strip club, all acting buddy-buddy with each other, after they had spent so many years murdering each other and blowing each other up. A trip to a strip club is what ended it. Which is a testament to the power of massive titties. We all love massive titties. I love them, you love them, I don't care if you're gay, straight, whatever. I don't care, we all love massive titties. The moral of the story here is massive titties. That's it, just those two words. That's the moral. Massive titties. But, like many other ceasefires, this didn't last very long, and violence kicked up again when Rock Machine agreed to join another well-known US biker gang called the Bandidos, who are, again, enemies of the Hells Angels. But this violence wouldn't last very long, because as soon as the government saw this shit starting to kick off again, they came right the fuck in, guns blazing, and put their foot down. And they massively slowed down the attacks between either side, because they had pretty much all high-ranking members of all of the gangs under 24-hour surveillance. There were a few reasons as to why the war ended, with one being the general exhaustion between both sides. I mean, to put it into perspective, 162 people died during the war, with hundreds of people being injured, both bikers and civilians. This, along with the more effective police tactics to combat the bikers and the eventual merging of Rock Machine into the Bandidos, the war just eventually petered out. Because most of the guys were starting to realise that this conflict wasn't going to end with the glory, money and power that they were looking for when they first joined the gang. It was most likely going to end either in prison or 6 feet under. So both sides pretty much just decided to cut their losses and call it a draw. With the biker merge hitting Rock Machine, the newly made Bandidos eventually handed over Quebec to the Hells Angels, and the alliance was basically wiped out, with the Hells Angels ruling over Quebec in 2003. Although that's not the end of the story just yet, and although the main war ended many years ago, many other biker gangs popped up within Canada, and old rivals attacked each other over the next few years. Because, of course they do, they're biker gangs, they don't like each other very much. But even though to this day they still attack each other, it's been nowhere ever near the scale of the all-out war that they had in the 90s, where they were literally blowing each other up with car bombs. So, after this story of stabbings, shootings, murders and bombings, the main thing that we learned today is that maybe French Canadians aren't as gay as we thought. And also, God bless massive titties.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.